Hello, good morning all. Deb Myhoff with Communitas, the facilitator for the Oregon Housing Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee meeting, our 15th meeting. Well done making it this far. And appreciate all of the hard work. Mari, if you want to go ahead and start or maybe you already have started the slide deck, that would be great. I have too many windows open, but I'm getting there. Okay, great. Thank you. And you can go ahead and advance, Mari. So this morning, just to mention to some of our resources in the room, we have our team from DLCD. Maybe you all, Mari, Celestina, Thea, you can introduce yourselves real quickly.
Happy to kick us off. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. My name is Mari Valencia Aguilar, she, her, they pronouns, housing planner with the department. I'll hand it over to Celestina.
Thank you, Mari. Good morning. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, housing planner here at DLCD. Thea?
Hi all, Thea Croman, she, her pronouns, and also a housing planner at DLCD. Nice to see you all.
Good morning. Thank you all. And very pleased to see Alan here, Alan Lazo, LCDC Commissioner and Liaison and Fair Housing Expert. What a nice pleasure to see you back.
Thanks, Deb. Good morning, everyone. Alan Lazo, LCDC Vice Chair, and glad to be here finally.
Thanks, Alan. And I am sure, I don't see them yet, but I'm sure someone with Oregon Housing Community Services will be here as they typically are. And we can introduce them when they show up. So thank you all. As we mentioned at last week's meeting and in the agenda package, the real focus for our meeting today is to review the rules around the contextualized housing need piece. And you also noticed, I'm hoping in your package, that there are the rules, version 3 rules around that. There's also an alternative approach that DLCD worked up to try to get at some of the feedback we've already received on the contextualized housing need. And so we're going to have discussion about all of that. And Celestina and Mari will get you lined up before we get there. So purpose of the meeting today, of course, is to review that and facilitate a shared understanding about the changes between the second and third iteration of draft rules, identify and discuss potential improvements to that third iteration, and also facilitate a discussion on this alternative approach that was sent out in your packet and we'll have a little short poll at the end, kind of taking a temperature on how close we are to realizing the charge of our work here. So specific to the contextualized housing need. So I'm looking forward to this. And without further ado, I will keep us moving along because there's a lot to cover. Let's talk about the racial equity framework for this morning.
I think I might offer you a moment to do our objectives, Deb, and then
I just did. I'm sorry, I covered them before the
Oh,
slide.
I see. Oh, yes, you did. You did.
My apologies.
You're just behind on the slide. Now I'm catching
along.
Yeah, now I'm there with you. Thank you so
Great,
much.
thanks.
It's
okay.
The error was on my end. Oopsies.
All good.
Yes. Okay. Great. Good morning, everybody. We are old hat now at referring to these racial equity framework for decision-making areas of consideration, but really action that we're charged with trying to implement. But nonetheless, I will go over them for the purposes of today. And I think that really at this point in the process, we're looking at all of these 8 areas, and they really have become even more kind of focal points, I would say, as we're honing in on how to best affirmatively further fair housing and implement those principles in the Housing Production Strategy Program. So I'll just take a moment to put voice to each of these areas, and as always, encourage us collectively to bring them into our discussion and our consideration of various rule approaches as we're refining. So We've got historical inequities, benefits and burdens, data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, accountability, restorative justice, decision-making, and measuring and evaluating outcomes in continuous improvement. With that, well, let's jump into our discussion for today and bring those with us. So today, as Deb mentioned, we are going to dig into specifically the contextualized housing need portion of the draft rules. And we're going to orient our conversation today back to our LCDC Land Conservation and Development Commission charge and our legislatively directed principles. And I actually realized just minutes before we started, Mari, that let's jump to the next slide first, slide 8, yeah, and then we'll just jump back for a moment. Thank you so much. So we thought that we would recap the statutorily directed principles, and the reason I made that swap is because our LCDC charge kind of builds off of these statutorily directed principles. So as we're nearing the end of these draft rules, tying back to those anchors felt like a helpful way to navigate some of these kind of late stage decisions. So I won't read through each of these, but I'll kind of characterize that I think there are a few types of principles that we have here. There are a few of these principles that really orient to values and kind of prioritization. So safe, accessible, affordable housing in communities of each Oregonian's choice, equitable housing being a top priority, focusing on fair and equitable housing outcomes, environmental justice, climate resilience, and access to opportunity. So there's a lot there, and we're really trying to hold and bring through all of those values that are put forward here in the statute. Then there's some more operational directive, I would say here, around the fact that the HPS is now the focal point to address and eliminate barriers to housing production, so that this work is really like, as it says, the focal point, but we're trying to pull all these threads truly through this particular piece of planning work. And additionally, that local governments, to the greatest extent possible, take actions within their control to meet housing production targets. So I'd say those are kind of the operational pieces that I think we're working with in framing these rules. And then some additional kind of supports and focuses, also somewhat operational, that technical assistance, tools and resources, and expertise should be provided to local governments from the state, which we will continue to develop, as you all know, in 2025, and really technical assistance and resources beyond then. So not as much a focus for today's conversation, but of course that topic and that interplay has come up in our work. And then lastly, that housing production should not be undermined by litigation, regulatory uncertainty, and things in that regard. So trying to bring, I might say, clarity and as much certainty, as it says, as possible. So with that, I will have us go back to the previous slide where for the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee and our charge from LCDC for this rulemaking overall, a lot of those pieces got distilled down into a rulemaking charge for us. Not everything is represented here, so that's why we did want to also check in with that statutory language. But for the most part, it's all kind of summarized here in that we are working toward safe, accessible, climate resilient, and affordable housing options that affirmatively further fair housing, and with particular focus for underserved communities. So those, as concise as we're able to get it so far. And then also that we provide tools, again, to support local implementation in the housing production strategy. With that, I will jump into our contextualized housing need rules work. So hopefully we'll be bringing those, I should say, we'll be bringing questions about how well we've really pulled those principles through the draft rules somewhat regardless of whether we've proceed with our 3.0 draft or our alternative approach or some combination, but also at the very end of our session, we'll be asking more pointedly about if you think that the 3.0 draft does a better job of reaching those principles than the alternative. So keep those in mind as best you can. We're happy to revisit those as needed. But just kind of emphasizing that that's the frame that we're hoping to carry with us today as we receive feedback from you all on where to go in some of these final refinements. So I will start with, as Deb said, we've released our 3.0 draft, and then in trying to work somewhat in real time with feedback before releasing an actual additional draft of rules, we've also provided this alternative approach potentially for consideration for the contextualized housing need. So I'm going to go over each of those separately. So starting with the 3.0 draft and giving some highlights about what the changes were in there between our second rule and our third rule. And then we'll go on to those potential alternative adjustments as well. So in 3.0, some of the highlights are that for the inventory and evaluation of local conditions and the contextualized housing need, that section 1, in response to concern about the workload of the past discriminatory actions, kind of research and evaluation, the need to do that work was reduced from every HPS to only once every 3 HPSs. In the alternative approach, there's another amendment made, which we'll get to. In 3.0, we also added in reference to tribal communities as one of the communities in the list of federal, state, and local protected classes, named communities in the needed housing statute, and all the communities that we're trying to focus on. Tribal communities were added because they weren't named explicitly in the rule previously. And while frequently data collection speaks to Native American populations as a race in census data and things like that, really naming tribal communities as a focus community of their own was important. So we added that in and are continuing to refine that. Additionally, in terms of the engagement that goes into this work, I don't think there were major adjustments to the charge really of the rules in the engagement, but we did make some refinements to hopefully add clarity around what is expected, what should be produced as a result of the engagement, what the summaries are, and who should be considered for engagement. But for example, not that every single category of potential community members must be engaged. And so some clarifying items like that. And then lastly, for this inventory and evaluation of local conditions section, we tried to more clearly spell out that the inventory and evaluation of local conditions is really a precursor to the fair housing issue area analysis, because we were hearing some confusion about how they work together. So there is a rule, subsection of rule that was added in the inventory and evaluation of local conditions that speaks to how it is supposed to feed the fair housing issue area analysis. And then simultaneously in the fair housing issue area analysis subsection, it begins with stating that the groundwork for the fair housing issue area analysis is the inventory and evaluation of local conditions. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the fair housing issue area analysis in the 3.0 rule. Wonderful, thank you, Mari. So a few adjustments were made here. Again, this is in that 3.0 version. There was a one-word change, but a significant change in fair housing issue area F, where actually our consultant, Dr. Tremolay, asked a question of whether the intention was to disrupt patterns of integration, because that's kind of how the issue area was written, to disrupt patterns of segregation and integration. And that is not the intention. And so the word integration was replaced with concentration, segregation and concentration. We've actually continued to hear some questions around whether to maintain that word as well, but that change was made in 3.0. An addition was made to the conclusions of this section, noting that, and just again, pulling some threads through a little bit more clearly, that the conclusions related to housing types, characteristics, and locations that are then used to select actions in housing production strategy need to not only remedy and mitigate the fair housing issue areas identified, but if there are any other types, characteristics, and locations that are needed beyond those fair housing issues in order to meet the housing production targets, that should also be considered. Really, we're trying to use the fair housing issues as a way to do this contextualization, but we didn't want to lose the thread of those housing production targets as well. So that was added in there. Deb, I see you came off mute.
Nope, keep going.
Oh, okay. And then just a couple more pieces here. We received feedback suggesting considering an amendment to the fair housing issue area of fair housing choice for people with disabilities to specifically name patterns of segregation and integration or concentration, or to add to the fair housing issue area specifically about segregation and concentration and its patterns of racial and ethnic concentration and segregation, and poverty and affluence segregation and concentration, that we add that's another layer of concentration and segregation for people with disabilities. And it was tough kind of evaluation, because throughout this whole process we're in this position of trying to sort out where particular communities need to be highlighted in a particular light. And so far, with kind of the way that federal affirmatively furthering fair housing focuses are, and just the really specific way that racial and ethnic communities have been targeted and segregated and concentrated, we kept the issue areas as they were, really highlighting that relationship between segregation and concentration of racial and ethnic populations as correlated with affluence and poverty. But part of that is because fair housing choice across the board already includes locational choice and already includes an element of maybe not integration, but choice, that folks should be able to choose where they live and live in any community or any part of their community. And so that certainly is not lost for people with disabilities or for any other protected class that is protected and we're trying to work to offer fair housing choice for. So that was that item. And then lastly, we wanted to continue to better integrate these rules with our transportation planning rules. And so with consultation internally at the department and with other feedback from public comment, we integrated a conclusive item for those jurisdictions who are subject to some of our transportation planning rules to identify the number of units that they're planning for in their climate-friendly areas. We also made an error, and that was duplicated in 2 areas of the rule, and we flagged that as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Deb for a moment to have a quick moment of check-in before we go to the alternative approach.
Great, thank you, Celestina. As Celestina just mentioned, just want to take a second here to see if you have any clarifying questions about changes made between version 2 and version 3 of the rule before we move on to the alternative approach. And we're also happy to take those questions after we run through the alternative approach, if that's how it goes too. But anything Celestina just mentioned or in the policy notes that you have questions about? All right, hearing none so far, let's carry on. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay. Wonderful. So this alternative approach that we provided, as mentioned in the attachment, we didn't do a true track changes, but wanted to just for kind of readability purposes. But we highlighted in that memo, and I realized that we should have color coded better. In our slides here, we used red to kind of draw attention to some of the changes, and in the memo we used green, so forgive me for that. But I will just go over a few of those significant adjustments for consideration in the alternative approach. So one of them is to make some refinements, again, for clarity in what we are actually naming that step one kind of the contextualized housing need, and moving from inventory and evaluation to collection and review. And what we're trying to do is just queue up this first step and part of the rule as like the words say, collecting all of these data sources and a preliminary look at them, kind of to make sure that they're cohesive enough, or to consider what gaps there might be to fill in with community engagement as the community engagement is conducted. But not that there is a true distinct analysis in any robust way, because that is what that second section is supposed to be, that fair housing issue area analysis. So hoping to bring clarity there. Also, in this alternative approach for consideration, we moved the past discriminatory actions analysis, mapping, and comparison to current trends into the list of data points that are, as the rule states, as available and applicable. So there's less of a requirement there. To the extent that information is readily available related to past discriminatory actions, then a local government would be charged with utilizing that. But if it's not readily available, then you know, there wouldn't be an obligation to do that work. So there's trade-offs there. The thinking was oriented to being responsive to the significant workload that not only we heard in advisory committees, but also from consultants and some experts in, you know, the historical and research fields about what that could really entail to undertake. So we're definitely interested in hearing thoughts about that. And additionally, let's see, I just want to make sure, I think I have one more note here, which is that we added a small item for the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice at the county level, if it's applicable, or even if there is any region-wide information that could be considered as well. But we had previously only referenced the state of Oregon analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And with that, I think we'll actually move to that second analysis piece, where most of the alternative adjustments live. So this is the largest, probably, I mean, certainly in word count, but also maybe in substance and impact, potential change in the alternative approach. So you'll see that on this, both in the rule, in the alternative rule, and on our slide here, we've changed even the language from fair housing issue area analysis to just fair housing analysis. And that represents that we pulled the fair housing issue areas out of this version of the draft rule. So instead of naming issue areas and leaving it up to local jurisdictions to conduct analyses and look at the data and come to conclusions kind of based on their own research pathway, maybe we could say, with the ask from local governments to be more clear about what's expected, about what should actually be provided in the course of this work, and not having a whole lot of options. The only option we could come up with was to name different analyses that should should be conducted and could be clearly illustrated, you know, in a report, kind of one by one. And so that's where we landed, and in incorporating the issue areas, and in many cases, you'll probably see somewhat in relief the issue areas corresponding with some of these analyses. We pulled those through, and then we also ended up with 8 analyses total, just in trying to be comprehensive of some of the analysis areas that maybe would have bridged different issue areas, and all of the data that is going to be available with the equity indicators dashboard. So we're very eager to hear what you all think about the potential proposal here, and the trade-offs, and what might feel better or worse compared to draft 3.0 there. And that being said, we also adjusted the introduction sub-rule language to note that these analyses should be conducted for those focus communities to the extent that data is readily available. So that was made more explicit than it had been in the previous rule. And so overall, with that, what we want to capture and what we're trying to capture is taking an approach to these rules of writing them such that a local government can accomplish them today, without writing them in a way that limits potential future data availability. We know that there are a number of campaigns focused on different types of data sets, both related to housing and just related to different populations in Oregon underway, and could be available as soon as the coming years. And so we're trying to, again, take this approach of how do we write the rules in a way that leaves that is both clear, that leaves room for future data to be utilized, and also is actionable today and tomorrow. With that, let's see. I think only one more item to highlight, which is that in the engagement for the contextualized housing need, not only did we add the tribal communities item, but we actually named focuses for the engagement in this work. So not only do we have all of the communities that under consideration for housing issue, or I'm sorry, protected classes, and the communities named in needed housing, but for the purposes of engagement, we specifically are encouraging focus and actually requiring focus on communities of color, low-income communities, people with disabilities, and tribal communities. And that short list ties to the benefits and burdens analysis that's required in the housing production strategy action by action work. So that's a lot, but I hope that we can certainly take time for questions and clarifications to help support you all queue up and participate in this conversation. But a lot of these items were also responsive to feedback from you all here in the NAPTAC. And so very curious to hear what you think. With that, I will hand off to Deb and Madi, who will help queue us up for some of that discussion.
Great. Madi's going to queue us up for discussion, but before we do that, let me check in to see if there are any clarifying questions about anything Celestina just mentioned. And I'm guessing with the alternative approaches, there might be some in the discussion as well. But Alan, please go ahead.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks, Celestina and Mari for this. I've been traveling, so I've had a chance to review a bunch of this. So I had a couple, and hadn't been part of the conversations actually. So I'm curious about the piece that was added about the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice for the counties. Is there I couldn't find, is there also a specific reference, because it's more likely that a city would have an analysis of impediments, and so is that a required part there? And also, generally speaking, what we find is that the county analysis of impediments is exclusive of cities that might also be entitlement communities within them. So Washington County is the example, for instance, right? Washington County has its own AI for the non-Beaverton, non-Hillsborough sections. I'm trying to think of, I don't know that there are too many other entitled counties that aren't like that. So, but the real question is this supposed to be parallel to the city AI requirement for data? And if so, is that included in there?
Yes, great questions, Alan. So the city AI is not named analysis of impediments, but the consolidated plan for any of HUD's community planning and development formula grant programs, including the community development block grant entitlement communities. That's the language that is included above. That is actually more like required. Like if you have any of this information, you must use it. And then later on, the state of Oregon does the balance of the state AI. And so that was named as available and applicable. If there's any information that's applicable to your work in this document, utilize that. And to your point, and this was actually a discussion that we had, does it make sense because the entitlement communities have their own work to even name the county AI? And we were kind of scrolling through the data that's available in there and just thought that there might be some regionally relevant information. So it's as available and applicable. But like I said, to your point, if we feel like it is more confusing than helpful, we could certainly remove it.
I also had a question about the alternatives. And I just want to make sure I'm clear on the crosswalk between the fair housing issues area analysis, which is currently contained in the contextualized housing needs, right? It's that list of fair housing issue analysis that has the seven. The seven areas that start with fair housing, tenure, and wealth building choice, right? That would be crosswalked against the where the alternative begins. This analysis at a minimum must include, and then that has that list of 8 items.
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
And yes, we did not provide a sort of diagrammatic crosswalk. I imagine that would have been helpful. Apologies
I'm looking
for
on
that.
our screen now to see. Yeah. Okay. So but that's what we should be comparing is that change, and to see if one list is more inclusive or exclusive of the other, generally speaking.
Yeah, and then the approach, kind of difference in approach as well.
Great. All right. Thanks.
Maybe if helpful to Alan, and maybe others are having the same thought here, is the alternative approach is our attempt to be responsive to feedback around a desire for more clarity on expectations around what a fair housing issue area analysis might entail. And so this is an alternative approach to be responsive to feedback from folks here, folks at the RAC level, and even consultants. And our attempt at an approach without much just based on that feedback. There wasn't, I don't know if the feedback was pointed, but it was our attempt to be as responsive. And so the intent there is it would have been helpful to do that one-to-one comparison, but the thought is that we, in our attempt to put the analyses approach forward in the alternative approach, was to not lose the fair housing issue areas or just the intent behind local jurisdictions doing that work at their discretion, but and ensuring that maybe in this list that's still, you can still see those hopefully, but of course that's up for discussion too today. So
thank you for the clarifications on that as well. Mary Kyle, clarification question.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I was also traveling, so I have not read the memo, so apologies. So I have a couple clarifying questions, and kind of depending on what they are, maybe more discussion later. But so first, who determines if and when data is sufficiently available to then be incorporated into the various analyses the city does?
So the orientation at this point of the program is largely to state provided information, but I think the language that we have here is readily available from existing local, regional, state, federal, academic, or other reputable sources. So who determines what is readily available? From probably regional, state, and federal would probably be pretty obvious in terms, I think, in terms of what is made available. Well, maybe I should say the state. The state, we are providing housing equity indicators, and we are providing the housing production dashboard. So I think that information is certainly readily available. But I think one of the thoughts also behind this is that if there are academic groups or local community groups who make information readily available and can, document that and illustrate that, then it's been made readily available. But there's no, at the moment, that we don't have a clearinghouse or a particular website or a particular location that says this is the information, and if it's here, then it's readily available. We don't currently have that.
At the minimum, it sounds like what's on the dashboard, which is a dynamic thing, is readily available. And then as the years tick forward, it might be useful to think about how to address that. So the state agency and local governments aren't going back and forth on what's readily available. Or given the staffing of some local governments, it might be readily available, but they don't know about it, right? And so I think as much as the state can do to help negotiate that. Can you go back? I think it's one slide, maybe it's two. Oh, there. So under optional, it says review of past discriminatory actions or practices. And I'm confused that that's under optional. I understand that if the data is not readily available, then that wouldn't be undertaken. But if it is readily available, it's not optional to do that, right? I'm just confused by it being under optional.
Yes, yeah. We could have used the exact words which are in the rule, which are as available and applicable. And that's the section of rule that work was moved under.
I would put it under required then, required as available and applicable, or some other category that's as available and applicable. But putting it under optional there sounds like even if it's readily available because the words aren't there, then it's still optional. So that confused me. And then if you can refresh my memory, how much of this do cities have to do only every 3 cycles, which is all of the CHN, or just the past discriminatory part that's every 3 cycles? So
and bear with us here because there are a lot of variables that we've been trying to distinguish. So in the 3.0 version of rules,
right,
the way that we were trying to manage this feedback that this past discriminatory actions work was too much was to make only that portion required only once every 3 cycles because it endures longer. It's a historical look back. So in the 3.0 version, the approach that is proposed is to say, do this once, and then three cycles ahead, do it again and see if you've made significant changes or if there has anything that has changed in history. Then in the alternative approach, that is actually cut. The once every 3 cycles thing is pulled, and it's just in this portion of the contextualized housing need that is as available and applicable every year.
Every time a contextualized housing need is done, if that's available and applicable. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sticking with clarifications for now, I know we want to shift over soon here. Go ahead, Brock. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have 2. So in the alternative version for the fair housing analysis, I have the differences between 2 and 3. One that wasn't brought up was that in version 2, or I guess actually in version 3, but not the alternative version, there was a piece at the very end that said basically like in any other community that the city believes has negative impacts. But it looks like that was removed. So I was just looking for some clarification as to why that was removed. And then the other part in the alternative subsection A, 2 and 8, it talks about access to home loans and analysis of lending practices. And I love to see the analysis of that. I just wonder if that's more appropriate to do at a state level, like if there's really as much nuance in that from city to city, or if that's something that the state would be in a better position to take a look at and say like, hey, here's what we have, because it seems less like a land use planning piece and more of a kind of private industry financing and equity from that standpoint. So whether or not that's basically appropriate to be having the cities do, or if that's something better for the state to do.
Yeah, I'll hop back maybe to the first one, and then maybe if you like the second one seems like maybe a point of conversation, but for the first item, yes, the charge, another way that we tried to pull back the breadth of the required analysis potentially for this fair housing analysis work was to just name the communities to consider and to evaluate as data is available, rather than to have this item of and any other community experiencing disparate housing outcomes, kind of trying to take a position of this list that we have is fairly extensive. It certainly doesn't mean that there will not come a day where there is a community that's not listed there, but trying to balance scope with some sort of focus. And for the second item, I think, definitely good questions about what maybe the state can provide moving forward, but I'll hold that one maybe for discussion.
Yeah, maybe one thing I'll offer on that particular piece for you, Brock, and for the group to consider is our charge is to integrate fair housing frameworks into the Housing Production Strategy program. So, right, the words of House Bill 2001 is to integrate affirmatively furthering fair housing into the HPS program. And so if we look to fair housing planning frameworks, they do a lot of that sort of analyses, because it really gives an understanding of who has housing choice. So just want to, we can have the discussion about whether it is appropriate or not. I think those are valid, but I just want to make sure that we all have the common understanding of the intent there, that we're trying to balance this charge and what that means. And I will also say some jurisdictions do that already by way of maybe work that they have to do because they're an entitlement community. They're receiving federal funds, and by receiving federal funds, they have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. Maybe they don't, because the standards and requirements are still kind of up in the air. However, how do we build a program that explicitly gives us that direction to affirmatively further fair housing? And in light of just some shakiness at the federal level. So all your points are wonderful to raise, and I'd love to have if anyone has thoughts on that, definitely in the discussion. But just wanted to give you a little bit of kind of the thinking of why that shows up there, and all the threads we're trying to to balance and see how to put forward. And again, we're in refinement, so we can continue to refine, and I think it's all worth thinking through.
And
Specifically.
again, agree with the intent, just thinking about the scale and who does it. Yeah.
Thank you for that. 2 more questions about clarifications, and then let's get into that discussion, because I think we'll continue to learn more together as we have that conversation. But Alan, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just sticking on the clarification side. So older adults shows up one time in the 3.0 rules under characteristics. It doesn't show up at all in the alternative approach. Was that due to it not being a fair housing issue under affirmatively furthering fair housing, because we've talked about age not being a part of that kind of understanding or fair housing related definition?
So older adults are one of the named communities in the needed housing statute. So we've, at the moment, referenced the statute rather than listing the named communities, because even last cycle, that list changed. So it's possible that that statute will continue to be iterated in the coming years. So at the moment, the rules are drafted with just a reference, but I believe the named communities are older adults, students, agricultural workers, and I'm missing the last one, y'all. And so that is named, right? Protected classes and named communities in needed housing.
Okay, so
Does that answer your question?
could come to, yeah, be further clarified in the alternative approach when looking at those groups. It just, yeah, wasn't explicit, and I was trying to figure out if it was because the affirmatively furthering fair housing doesn't include age or not. We can get back to the broader discussion, but it's helpful to know that, yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Appreciate that. Alexandra, please go ahead.
I actually think my items may be more for the general discussion. It's kind of piggybacking off Brock's comments about mortgage data availability and that kind of area.
Well, if you don't mind, let's get the discussion sort of framed up from Mari, and then we can move on to comments. Is that okay? Great. Mari.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to navigate all the buttons that I need to navigate. All right, so moving on to discussion, I think, in that clarification piece, you heard a little bit about the intent behind why there is now an alternative approach. And really what we're trying to balance is, the principles and the charge that Celestina outlined earlier in her presentation, as well as the feedback that we've been hearing and receiving from this group, from the RAC, from consultants, and all the areas of comment that we're, receiving about the rules, and in particular, the contextualized housing need is a critical piece that informs the actions that local jurisdictions kind of outline in their HPS. And some of these pieces that we've been hearing is around just a desire for more clarity in the rules to really set the expectations of to outline the expectations of what local jurisdictions are expected to do, not just in this piece, but in all of the various pieces of the rules. But in particular, kind of we've been hearing a desire for more clarity here, and I noted that desire was there, but not really hearing much specifics. And so that is our attempt here to, given we've been working on 3.0, but still we're hearing lots of feedback around a desire for more clarity. We took a step back and said maybe this is in a way this alternative approach could be responsive to this desire of clarity without really hearing exactly what feels unclear, and in particular, maybe more focus on the analysis part of how jurisdictions would do the fair housing issue area analysis or the fair housing analysis. And so keep that in mind, that we're trying to solve for this desire for more clarity, just generally in our rulemaking, but also with this alternative approach to this particular piece of the housing production strategy program. We're trying to stay true to the charge that we've been given to affirmatively further fair housing in the housing production strategy. And really all the various pieces of what that means that Celestina kind of noted: safe, affordable, near community assets, and the list goes on, resilient, climate resilient. Like, we're trying to balance and weave that here, as well as kind of in the same thread or the theme that we discussed last week, which is an important piece to keep in mind, is the capacity and the resources that jurisdictions have to do this work. And so as we balance these very difficult pieces, that is what is informing an alternative approach. And we want to talk about that. We want to talk about the trade-offs between, what the 3.0 looks like and what we've been discussing versus this alternative approach, all at the same time while we're weighing and balancing the things that we need to consider that I just named and are noted here in this green box. And so these discussion questions, I'll kind of walk through them, are really to try to pull that out. We want to understand and we want to hear what your reactions are to these two approaches. And we don't have to go with one and we don't have to go with two. There are trade-offs, but we want to hear, the specifics and the things that we all should grapple with that are worth discussing and informing the continuation of staff's refinement to these rules in particular. We want to know, what on the thread of clarity, does the alternative approach offer that? Are we actually being responsive to the call for clarity? Recognizing we didn't have pointed feedback around what clarity within the contextualized housing need is needed, but this is something we put forward, so we want to hear about that. And we also want to hear about any other concerns around maybe resources or capacity or things, even Brock, that you brought up about whether it makes sense or not. Like all of that is definitely something to bring forward, whether it be in the 3.0 or whether it be on the alternative approach. And then just generally any concerns about both approaches, but really leaning into this alternative approach. So with that, hopefully that's kind of a good cue up for what we're trying to hear from you all and discuss in this meeting. And I'll hand it back to you, Deb.
Great, thank you. And just sort of want to acknowledge the start of comments that were coming in, sort of a flag for readily available and applicable data determination, especially as it's thought about over time, probably needs a little more work in the rule. And then the point that Brock brought up about analysis of lending at the local level may be not necessary because it's probably similar statewide. It might also be quite a lot for local planners to do that. And I'll just sort of cue that up for Alexandra if you have some additional comments on that. And thank you for your patience. And then we'll move on in the discussion.
Yeah, of course, no worries. This is kind of my former hat at Oregon Housing and Community Services and kind of transferring over into my current hat. So I worked a lot with our homeownership division, and I can tell you that getting lending data on kind of on a more, pinned in level, kind of a more zoomed in level can be quite difficult, and additionally quite arduous and sometimes quite costly. And so especially for our smaller cities and our smaller localities who don't have near the amount of staff time and B, not kind of the budget, that's going to be extremely difficult. And I think when we look kind of at mortgage lending practices across the state of Oregon as a whole, we see very similar trends. So I think, we have a lot of that data already available on the state level, or it can be made available on the state level. So I would really encourage for kind of areas where that is available and applicable, that would be really helpful. Just kind of in terms of cities. And then kind of my secondary comment is I very much appreciate some of the additional flexibilities and alternatives presented in the, what are we calling it? 3.0 alternative version.
Alternative approach.
Yeah, the alternative approach, I think it's very helpful for a lot of our smaller cities where there's not kind of that level of capacity. We do have, our larger cities where they do have the capacity to do this work and are already engaging in this work in a lot of cases. But for our smaller cities where, they are very staff limited and very kind of fiscally limited, already facing fiscal cliffs, it's extremely helpful.
Great, thank you. Really nice to have your perspective and experiences working with OHCS as well. Alan, please.
Thanks, Deb. Let's see. I'm gonna play several roles here. So the first, I will speak from a fair housing perspective, SME subject matter expert perspective, and really I want to support what Mari said about the use of home mortgage data is a pretty common exercise in fair housing analysis. And it can really identify really micro lending patterns in communities about where access to capital is or is not available. And not even historically. We know that even today that those patterns of sort of de facto redlining occur today. So it's important data. And I don't think Brock's question was whether or not it would be helpful at the local level. I think his question is whether or not it should be analyzed at the local level versus, and not even analyzed at the local level versus the state level, but who should do that? Whether local entities should do it or the state should do it. It should be analyzed at as local level as we can. And I agree that potentially the state might be better at it, and potentially even just be able to include that in the equity dashboard if it's not. It is hyper local data. I mean, and so it's available. And I think you're right. Cost and effort might point to it being a state function and even a dashboard function, since it's essentially federal data that's available through the through federal agencies. So let me step away from that for a second, and let me speak now just to the discussion point around the alternatives versus the fair housing issues analysis. And I think what I would say, and I'll step all the way out to my fair housing advocate role, and because I haven't approached this material before and haven't been part of discussions, I think the one thing I'm leaning right now at first blush of this is that the alternative feels like a good start on guidance. That the highest level of framework should exist at the rules level, and we can provide this kind of detail, this kind of guidance specifically on what does this mean, what does it look like, what should it entail through guidance. And I think you've tried to leave it open enough to evolve as a rule, but I think there's also a way to combine these two things. And again, that crosswalk I think would show us how those two things get combined. No doubt, local jurisdictions need this kind of clarity. I don't know if they need it at the rule level. That's kind of where I would say as an advocate at this point. So, but I'm here to listen and can't wait to hear what other folks have to say and the evolution of this. So thanks for allowing me to step into those roles.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for cleaning up my language a little bit around the home mortgage research. I appreciate that a lot. And really want to invite cities to weigh in on this, in rule, better in guidance, what's the right level in rule here? I know there's been in other conversations with the RAC and you all just this kind of trying to find that right balance of certainty, clarity, but also avoid burdensomeness and make sure this can flex over time. Okay, so Brock, please.
Real quick, I just a big second to everything that Commissioner Lazo said, and I agree with the question of like, is this better to have as guidance versus in rule? And I think the simple rule with detailed guidance is the way to go. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra.
I'll kind of chime in with the city hat. I think there is a desire for more guidance or more information, just because I think there are a lot of questions when it comes to implementation, especially, goodness, I sound like a broken record, for our smaller cities, but also for our larger ones. But I do agree, kind of more flexibility in the rule itself, more kind of generalization in the rule itself, and kind of the knowledge and expectation that more guidance, more information will come with it, so that we have kind of a better grounding for our planners, and that when they're short on time and all of those things, to not have to, do too much digging to figure out exactly what path they're supposed to go down for these rules.
Thank you for that. Matt?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the first question on initial reactions, my initial reaction to the alternative approach had a lot to do with the readily available information. My hesitancy around that language is that I don't think it incentivizes the development of new data well enough. I think in some cases it might even discourage it. Because cities, could take the path of least resistance and just say, we don't have the available data, we can't analyze this. And I don't actually think that's consistent with the statute, which really called for looking into some areas that were new and novel to land use planning. And some of that looking into and some of that analysis is going to require new data. My suggestion would be that this be addressed more in terms of action items or adoption ready actions. Like cities don't, to put it another way, the creation of a tool to gather new data where data is missing could be an action in the housing production strategy within it. And under this alternative approach, I don't see that it's not going to be probably. And there's not a lot of incentive or, we're not requiring cities to do it. So they're not going to necessarily take that on. Some cities certainly will, but other cities won't. The other things I wanted to address have a little bit more to do with the question of clarity in the alternative approach, but also just in terms of the contextual housing need generally. I think the decision not to adopt more specific language around persons with disabilities in the fair housing issue analysis is a mistake. And there's 4 reasons why I think it should have been something that was included in version 3 and in the alternative analysis. Those 4 reasons are, particularly with regard to integration and segregation, the integration and segregation of people with disabilities is poorly understood as a concept and often overlooked, particularly since the rule actually only focuses on racial and ethnic integration segregation. I'm concerned that cities will not address disability related to integration and segregation. And the second reason I don't like that decision is that people with disabilities are also the highest source of complaints in fair housing law. And I think that should be acknowledged by more heavy of a focus in the fair housing, equitable housing analysis on people with disabilities. A third thing I wanted to point out is that, you emphasize that the AFFH currently stresses race and ethnic integration and segregation and poverty, but the proposed AFFH rules have clearly sought to change that, and they've included persons with disabilities in definitions for integration and definitions for segregation and definitions for fair housing choice. And those are all definitions that I think should be updated. There should be a definition for integration and segregation that includes people with disabilities under the rule. And that would lead into, that has a lot of implications for the contextual housing need analysis. And the fourth reason I think that it should have been included more explicitly is if you only call out racial and ethnic segregation and integration, or segregation and concentration, it seems to some that would be an exclusive list. So if you don't include persons with disability in the concepts of segregation and integration, and only reference racial and ethnic segregation integration, it seems like that's all you're asking for. And so I don't think that just the other language just about fair housing issue analysis and all protected classes is really going to get at this, because these concepts are poorly understood, and I don't think they would be addressed otherwise. So, I think those are some pretty specific suggestions, but to get into the nitty gritty a little bit more, and I'll try to do this quickly. When I look at the alternative approach, the data sources listed don't really relate to disability, but they could be addressed, like I said before, by beefing up the definitions, like beefing up the definition of past discriminatory actions, including a definition for integration and segregation that includes persons with disabilities. And also when referencing institutionalization, including institutionalizations of persons with disabilities, because once again, where institutionalization is referenced, it really seems to be implying incarceration. for people, for racial and ethnic populations. And that's odd to me. You know, if you're going to talk institutionalization in a fair housing analysis, it should certainly include thinking about people with disabilities and how they've been over institutionalized. And then, you know, I think in the section that talks about analysis must include, it references looking at housing need and affordability, and that's good. The one thing that I thought could be improved on there is it just generally makes reference at the end of that statement to an evaluation of sufficient accessible housing units. And I think that could be improved to talk about specific characteristics of accessibility. In other words, you know, to say something more like to examine specific accessibility characteristics as defined by UFAS, Fair Housing Act, state building codes, and how they were, and more importantly, how they correspond to the need for different types of disability. I think that kind of specificity is actually needed, because otherwise, I don't know that that cities are going to all be looking at those different types and parsing out the different types of accessible housing units and how they correspond to different types of disabilities. I could see some pretty generalized analysis that might occur there.
Matt, thank you for your thoughtful summation and also some ideas for improvements about how the rules could be guiding cities more effectively in thinking about people with disabilities and their housing needs and housing choice. I won't sum up everything you've said, but I want to see, I'm not sure I could, you've done it so well, but I do want to see if Madi or Celestina or anyone else has thoughts or comments or additional questions for Matt about any of that at this point.
I think I would love, I mean, all of that is great, Matt. Thank you so much. And you're always so great about offering recommendations and being specific. I'd love to hear the response. I'd like for this discussion to be organic and you know, robust. So definitely cities, any reactions to what Matt is offering, I definitely want to hear that. But for us as staff, I'm hearing it, I'm listening, we're taking notes. No specific kind of comment back, but just really trying to more so understand, you know, where cities are at based on what Matt just offered too. That might be helpful for us to understand too.
I think it's worth clarifying too, going back to the top, I heard you say, Matt, that the data sources aren't really speaking to those needs of people with disabilities. That is likely true. I will mention though that the equity indicators has some data around housing need for people with disabilities, as thin as it may be. I think that bucket of equity indicators is a lot of stuff. That doesn't look like it in one line, but I'm not saying it's adequate. Alan, thoughts on that, and then I'll go to Julia.
Yeah, thanks, Deb, because I did want to respond to what Matt said at the beginning of his statement about the sort of motivation for cities if we use that readily available framework. And I'll go back to, as somebody who was sitting at the table when the legislation was crafted, there was discussion particularly about data sources that were currently not available and the desire to incentivize that. And one of the very real examples is housing that is accessible, right? There is no data about housing that is accessible. You know, one of the pathways we've looked at is permitting. And, you know, as permitting comes through, you know, we would start to identify the accessibility of housing that's available. But there is no current data on where accessible housing is available. And so that was a point of conversation to say, yes, this is something we know we need to do, but the data doesn't exist, but we should move towards trying to get that data. So that point is well taken.
Another add to that, Celestina, before we take additional
Yeah, I wanted to take a small moment just to note your comment, Matt, on where past discriminatory actions explicitly now includes unnecessary institutionalization. And I had heard you say that you thought it was implied that that was limited to an orientation to, I don't know, disproportionate institutionalization of folks by race or ethnicity. And I think that's an area where we would definitely be interested in seeing, you know, how or why that is. But we specifically added that in response to some of your feedback, and specifically did not name particular communities so that it could apply to all of them. So it did not name unnecessary institutionalization of and a number of different classes, or incarceration of, or, you know, sundown laws, or block busting, or mortgage redline, mortgage access by any particular community. So it is not the intention that the institutionalization piece not be inclusive of people with disabilities. It's actually specifically in there for that purpose. But if there's anything in there that is leaning toward one community instead of another for some reason, then we could definitely amend that.
Well, if I could just respond to that, I'll be really brief. I think that section where it says unnecessary institutionalization and incarceration, everything else in that subparagraph really is more focused on race and ethnicity when you're talking about sundown laws, segregated schools, neighborhoods, parks, natural areas and their locations, redlining, insurance, blue line maps, block busting. So I don't think it leads into the, when we're talking about institutionalization with and incarceration, that I wouldn't necessarily pick up that is supposed to include institutionalization of people with disabilities in the context of that paragraph. So I think just putting something like institutionalization, including institutionalization of persons with disabilities and incarceration, would probably be the better approach.
That's helpful. Can Celestina or Matt, can you give us a reference on that section? Because I'm guessing others are scrambling to find that.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
The definition of past discriminatory actions. So it's in the definition section, Rule 5, number 29, and we are in sub C.
Great. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yes. Thanks, Matt.
Great. Let's continue the conversation about either pulling this thread or happy to talk about other parts of the alternative in version 3 and sort of how the contextualized housing need is shaping up. Julia, thank you for being patient.
Yeah, no problem. And apologizing off camera, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold, so also relatedly apologize if I missed some of this, but just wanted to kind of build on Matt's comments a little bit and just also emphasize hope for maybe this does exist somewhere in the rules, but hope for some kind of a backstop of sorts to just ensure that cities can't basically be like, this data doesn't exist, so oh well. I think that to a degree the equity indicators are meant to be a little bit of that, and some of the language in terms of like the specific populations that are being named in these rules are that. But again, just to I think reiterate, I think some of the points Matt was trying to make, I really want to make sure we're encouraging and incentivizing not only cities but also the state to be doing a better job of kind of creating some of these data sources for some of these areas that we know are lacking. That being said, I also really support this kind of more inclusive approach of what can be data in terms of kind of lining that out a little more clearly for cities, both by reducing a little bit of the burden in terms of listing these are the things that we know exist and that we would accept as sources, but then by way of that, if there are things that don't currently exist, we want to make sure that there's still, again, that kind of push towards either working with organizations that are pulling that data. For example, we know Alan Hines has been doing a lot of work on that with Community Vision. And so just trying to lift those up and really encouraging cities to partner with their local organizations that are doing this work on the ground and not just ignoring it because it means that they have to do more work if they look at those data sets. And I'm not saying that all cities will do that, but I think we can all agree that there are some cities that might. And so just want to, I don't know what the solution is, but just wanted to flag that there. And then also kind of related to that, again, I think Mary Kyle has brought this up a couple of times, and I'm sure others have as well, but just kind of hoping for, and maybe this lives in a guidance document versus the rules, but some kind of list that, again, just kind of lists out the issues, the sources, and then the data sources, and then also with that flagging gaps that we know are currently lacking on the data front, so that there can be kind of a collective understanding of that and then a collective effort towards reducing those gaps. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. I appreciate that. Alexandra, additional thoughts?
Yeah, so this is kind of a hard one just because balancing kind of the desire to engage in this work from a lot of our cities, from all of our cities, and also kind of what are increasing capacity constraints for many of our cities. Most of our cities, over 30% currently face fiscal cliffs, and an additional, portion are going to be facing a fiscal cliff in the next couple of years. And that's severely constraining staff time and the ability to, this really goes to kind of medium-sized and smaller cities to develop new data sources and spend kind of additional time on this. And so, where available and where kind of that capacity and, quite frankly, funding is available, that's work that our cities are more than happy to engage in. And this is, I think our common shared goal. But it is extremely challenging for some of our smaller cities where, maybe they have a part-time planner or things like that, where there's not that capacity to develop new resources. And they may want to, but it really is a capacity constraint. So I would say, yes, that is the goal. But when we're talking about city capacity, it is not universal that all cities have kind of the capacity of our larger cities, and so may not, be in that position. So where available, I would push towards, things that are available on the statewide dashboard, things that the state can kind of develop or larger localities can develop. Because on kind of a city by city basis, that kind of capacity, human capacity, is not necessarily available.
Thank you for that, Alexandra. I'm sensing that there's a lot of conversation that's headed in that direction, which is, data sources that are missing definitely need to be further investigated, as they have been, and the state needs to take a bigger role in helping cities fill those gaps and find those innovative methods or new methods to getting there. I want to also invite cities to really weigh in on whether this alternative approach is addressing some of the concerns we've heard from cities already, that it wasn't clear. Well, one, it wasn't clear what analysis they would have to go through for the contextualized housing need, and sort of what that entailed. So is this getting closer, further away than version 3, about the same? Is this, and then also acknowledging, I can't remember who said it in this meeting, just that some of this might be more detail than is necessary in rule. It would be better in guidance. I'd like to hear from cities your thoughts about that. Does this feel like the right level? Do we need more? So we really are just trying, again, this is a truly open question, just trying to figure out if this alternative approach is helping resolve some things without creating new problems? Or is it creating new problems while it's resolving things? So let's just talk about that a little bit.
I see Brianne from City of Bend with her hand raised, but I will say that especially, you know, there is a balance in between what goes in rule and what is just kind of guidance. By and large, I would say, you know, as long as you know the guidance is coming, as long as there is kind of the promise of guidance and the prompt provision of guidance, you know, more flexibility in rules, more flexibility in rule, and that's always helpful to that end. And then kind of on the front end, the first slide is how I'm envisioning things in my mind. In terms of flexibilities is extremely helpful for a lot of our cities. But happy to give some of our city partners the chance to chime in on their own.
Thank you, Alexandra. I appreciate that. Rachel, I didn't want to miss you. Please go.
I know I was actually just going to kind of reiterate what you just said. I was you know, just wanted to put out there that I would like to encourage fewer words in code and more guidance, because I think just the flexibility there is really important, and changing the guidance is so much easier for the long term. And also just wanted to point out that along with having limited capacities in the smaller cities, it's also more expensive and a longer process to get that data, where they already don't have the funds, they don't have the man or the person power. It takes more to get data. So it is a bigger lift for them.
Good points, Rachel. Thank you for that. Mary Kyle.
It sounds like the data issue exists, whether it's version 3 or the alternative, the challenges. And I think, but maybe Matt or Alan can clarify that the more robust incorporation of accessibility into the definition, I think, exists in both versions. I think there's some shortcomings, but in any event, on the data issue, as Julia said, I've suggested before that the state, you know, provide a list of all the data sources and their current, you know, adequacy, and that as to the degree possible, as new and better data comes on board, it's incorporated into the dashboard. But I am concerned, and this is where, when I asked who gets to say it's readily available, I am concerned about who makes that determination for data sources that are not produced by the government or like Community Vision was mentioned, but like the Coalition of Communities of Color has done a lot of reports that get right at these issues. And we have seen these types of things in other jurisdictions and regions, and those can and should be used, I think, or there should be a kind of a more objective ability to assess whether or not those should be used. Because I don't think it should all fall on cities. I think it's at all. I mean, the state should be doing as much as possible, and there's some really good sources out there that are private and nonprofit, academic, et cetera, and those should be looked to. But I don't want to see, and it's hopefully it's only a few, but might just say, we don't want to take into account that information for whatever reason, and then it's not used. So I don't really know how to get at that. I think in the best practices, in that stuff that's being put off until next year, amongst the best practices could be some best practices for cities, like at the permit desk. What could cities incorporate into like the checklist at the permit desk to just keep tracking some of these things, for example? I mean, just what are some simple best practices that potentially even a smaller city with a little staff could do? Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. I appreciate that. And I'm guessing Celestina has a question or additional thought on that.
Yeah, I think something I should have added earlier when I said we don't currently have a clearinghouse for data is that it's something that we've discussed having, like just having on the state's website where the HPSs are, the most recent community vision report, and the for Housing Council of Oregon's most recent report, and things like that. I think there's a question about how to reference that in rule, and again, we're hitting that kind of rule guidance sticking point. And while we don't necessarily define readily available, maybe we could, but even if we didn't, it seems like something that's on the guidance page, that lists some sources. It would be pretty reliable way to say that it's readily available. So I think that all of your points are very well taken and understandable, and also to support the cities, right? Because the cities don't want to go digging either. So I think that's a win-win. And I don't know if it's in our guidance concepts document, but I think there may be reference to it, to collecting additional data sources and noting them. And then I just wanted to note that the question about permit data fields is a big one. It is an ongoing conversation related to the housing production dashboard, particularly related to accessible housing data. So I think, potentially that can be local action, and also potentially that's at the state level, but just kind of like a yes to all of these things, and trying to sort out where exactly they go at this stage. Where are they referenced in rule, or what I'm hearing a lot of right now so far in the meeting is a push maybe actually back toward more guidance, or some balance there. So just wanted to add those items if it helps any further comments or follow-ups.
Yeah, and it'd be great to hear if there's pushback on that sense of things too. So Brianne, please.
Thanks. I would just say in general, the alternatives approach is extremely helpful to have a little bit more specificity on exactly what it is, the data that you are looking for, versus kind of more just the general in the 3.0 regular version. That said, I don't know if it has to live in rule or not, or guidance document. I guess I would want to give some more thought to that. Is it too specific? And I would just say if it does end up in guidance, I would just not caution, but just want to make sure that it is consistent, and it's just further clarity. It seems like in past rulemaking, sometimes there are things in guidance documents that kind of go above and beyond. I'm thinking of CFEC specifically, that is getting, it's not binding, so that can become awkward sometimes, I guess, in implementation. And then I would just second what other people have said about clarification on the readily available. And if that, was thinking like if that could live in some sort of like a data resource library and guidance or something to that effect would be extremely helpful. I mean, in looking even at the alternative approach, data, some of these, I mean, cities are in a hard position because some of this just we literally do not have, and there is not, without going door to door, there is not a way to get it, and we cannot go to door, and that's not even all that reliable. And I don't know that that's what the community would really even want us to be doing, especially some of these community members. So I think I like that, but I do think, like Mary Kyle McCurdy and others have said, like it would be helpful to get a little bit more grounding on what that readily available means. Yeah, I'm just looking at some of those and I'm like, it's great that they're spelled out, but I still don't know how we're going to get the data. Household wealth, we struggle with that all the time. And we have a ton of retirees. And when we do our equity mapping, it's showing some of our most expensive neighborhoods are the lowest income, and that's because they moved from California and bought a $3 million house and they have a ton of wealth, but it's not reflected in the data. So I guess just from someone that actually has to implement this, it's helpful to have the data spelled out, some of that more clarity in the alternative, but I still think it's going to be really hard for us to actually implement. Just my 2 cents.
Thank you. I appreciate your 2 cents and being honest with us. Ariel.
Yeah, I think I just want to add on to what Brianne said. I'm not sure there's much value add, but just reiterate, the alternative approach is really helpful to see sort of what that implied expectation was built into that Rule 3, and it just makes it a little like again, as an implementer, like I look at that and I see like, okay, this is what I need to do. And 6 years from now, and it sort of lays out a map of how to not do path of least resistance, but just like how to meet the requirements and what we're truly trying to get at with our housing production strategies. And I'll also say, I don't know, if that guidance should be prescribed in rule or in guidance either, but it is still helpful to see where it's going. And then to the sort of data points and data making that jurisdictions are, because I think there is an element of like, we are going to have to be creating some data through some of the next HPS cycles, especially where we're reporting out on the expectation of reporting on characteristics. That those items listed in the characteristics aren't necessarily data that's available, but if we're reporting, we will find a way to report what we can. And like, it is supportive to see some of that outlined also in the fair housing and the contextualized housing needs analysis, because it aids in some of the conversations we are having with our permitting department about what data is valuable. That adds, it adds to their workload also, but they're not necessarily as involved in the HPS reporting. Yeah, so it is helpful to be able to go into those conversations and say, look, like there's a state requirement that we need to be able to provide this data, and it helps sort of advocate or elevate those specific characteristics that we need to be tracking. Yeah.
That's super helpful. Thank you. I have a couple of specific questions, but before I even get there, I just want to kind of check in on a real high level question. All of this contextualized housing need is serving a number of purposes in the housing program, including helping folks understand what the need is so they can set their affordability type characteristic location, though ONA is setting the affordability brackets. And then it's also helping to inform cities on where they need to go and what the most urgent needs are for their communities for action planning. Does one or the other do this better, version 3? Or the alternative approach? Do they both do it equally well? Do you feel, especially cities or those who work with cities, do you feel like once a city goes through this contextualized housing need analysis in either option, are they in a place where they can set some actions and determine the type characteristics and locations of needed housing? Does it feel about right? Does the level of effort seem right for the tasks at hand? Small questions. Not sure. All right, I'm not seeing any opinions on this. Maybe we'll hear more. Those are the questions we're sort of juggling about and trying to make sure we're hitting the right level of analysis to the tasks at hand. All right, I'm going to ask keep chewing on that. I'm going to ask 2 specific questions about 2 specific things that Celestina brought up, and I just want to check in on that. And maybe we've already covered these, so forgive me. One is the past discriminatory actions. I think Mary Kyle, maybe you even mentioned, thought about this, but in the alternative version, in version 3, past discriminatory actions study is required every 3 cycles. And is a required bit of information and data that cities need to use in all cycles, but they only have to update every 3. And the alternative approach that's been moved to an as available and applicable section of the rule, and wondering what you all think about that. Does that feel about right, given where we are and what you all know about the level of effort and data that may or may not be available to complete those studies? Anyone have additional thoughts on that? Yeah, Mary Kyle, please.
That seems right to me because it does say as available or readily available, again, that definitional question. And I think Alan Lazo was very eloquent in the fact that this is still going on. And so 3 cycles is a generation. That's a hell of a long time. Seems right to me, knowing that if there isn't adequate information, it's just that part of the CHN it's just noted that we don't have any better or different information.
Thank you for that. And you also bring up comments that have been made since version 3 came out, but it's not just past historical or past discriminatory actions, but also current. Brock, thank you.
Less a comment, more a question for the cities. Does one or the other, either the once every 3 cycles or as available, is there like a large difference in the workload that either creates? And I don't have an answer, but just from city perspectives, I'd like to hear.
Once you have a study of some sort in place. I'm going to go to Kathy, and then maybe we can hear some responses to that. Brock, thank you for that. Kathy, please.
Yeah, I'm going to second what Mary Kyle said, because I think as you go through the process of trying to build housing, you're going to uncover additional discrimination, and you need to take that into account, and it'll become readily visible as you try to build housing. So I think that as available needs to be the standard.
Thank you for that. Brianne?
This is kind of a question back. Is clarification, are you only having to update the things that you did not provide data for because it wasn't readily available? Or are you having to update everything every cycle? Because some of it isn't going to change. It's like past discriminatory actions. I mean, yes, they are things that are happening in the next 5 years could become past discriminatory actions too. So probably good to look at those. But yes, it is definitely a bigger lift if we are redoing that every 7 years and doing the entire thing every 7 years. But if you're really only looking at like some of these things might be kind of no change or very minor change to the data or to the whatever the analysis point was. So it seems like you would almost want to like be able to continue to use the past ones for future update cycles if you already answered the question and not much had changed. And I'm not sure, that wasn't clear to me whether or not you're redoing the whole thing or you're redoing just the ones that you said we don't have a information for it every cycle.
I think the intention, Brianne, is any new information. So if like I hear you saying for the ones, like maybe the different little subsections. So if you had an answer for a subsection, but then the state came out with a new statewide, analysis of this particular type of discrimination that was then available, even if you had a previous answer and you had new information that was relevant, then you would layer that on, but not that you would have to recreate conclusions or information that was already assessed. I think the intention is, and the language may have been like update every 3 years, but maybe not. But I think that updating is more the intention than starting over at the beginning. And then certainly anything that, came to light in the actual time frame itself would be relevant.
I think you just accidentally misspoke. You meant to say every 3 cycles, not every 3 years. Yes.
Well, I mean, every 3 cycles, yes, or every cycle, either way, whichever interval we pick, yes.
And just really quickly, at kind of to Kathy's point, when she mentioned, like as we're going through this process, like new data is going to come to light, right? And we're going to have more analysis on this. At a certain point, are we going to get to with all the new data that we have coming in, will we get to a point where now this is like data is available, now this is required every cycle, and the analytical burden for cities of that versus the 3 year, and kind of where dividing line is.
I think that's a trick. And maybe some of this could be helped with some guidance about updates. But I hear your point too, Brock. Hopefully we're in a data or information rich environment to understand these issues better in the future. Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the cycles piece of it. With 3 cycles, that just seems like a long amount of time, maybe too long to me, because as I understand it, the cycles are 6 to 8 years. So that would mean once completed, they don't have to look at past discriminatory actions again for 18 years or 24 years. That's a really incredibly long time. And it gives me pause. Like I would probably, maybe 2 cycles, but 3 seems like too much. And then I think other folks have already hit on this, but just again, I agree with this question of like, if they couldn't analyze a past discriminatory action because of poor data, does that mean that they don't have to, that they get to reuse the past discriminatory action for 2 or 3 cycles? Does that include the sections that they didn't do because they said they didn't have enough information? Or does it suddenly become something they have to add to their past discriminatory actions if data becomes available? And again, I think it goes back to when you couple that with not encouraging the development of new data sources by just saying what's readily available, I could see subjects not getting addressed for decades, and that concerns me.
I want to just clarify, this might be what you meant, Matt. I just wanted to clarify though, that the 3 cycles is only currently written only as frequently as they need to update that study, but they have to use it in every cycle of planning. So it just may be 20-year-old data when they're using it or 16-year-old data when they're using it.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. I just think that age of data is really problematic, particularly if cities are off, some cities won't analyze things that are because of the lack of data sources today. And then let's say they have an action to increase data around that issue, while they still don't need to necessarily, as I read it, update it or for a period of 16 to 24 years.
Yeah, you've pointed
18.
out sort of a circular reference problem in there as well. So thank you, and totally hear you on the 3 cycles might be too long to wait to understand if discrimination is continuing or new discriminatory practices have shown up. Alexandra.
I think this one's a difficult balance in between the two because 24 years is a very long time. I think to Mary Kyle's point, that is a generation, in terms of kind of entrance into the housing market. I would be very curious in terms of kind of how this looks for implementation of cities for kind of additional guidance. And there's that kind of nebulous thing again of what it would look like kind of in practice to do updates on a more regular basis or as data becomes available. Because I think, and like what triggers a full reassessment versus what just triggers an update, and kind of on what kind of a timescale we're talking about cities having to think about doing an update. Because in a dream world, we're getting new data every year. Does that mean that cities are having to update it every year? Is it still on a cycle basis? Is it, if we choose kind of the alternative option, what does that actually look like in practice when new data becomes available? And what are we considering available, seeing as we don't have kind of that data clearinghouse that I think we've all kind of talked about? That would be great to have, wonderful, but like, as we're implementing this and kind of talking about it, that does not currently exist. So how do we dream about that world, talk about that world, and actually make some implementable rules that will work for cities and the communities inside them? I just have a lot of questions.
Yeah, I hear you. And it's a real balance. I mean, this is very important work and very important information for all of our communities and cities to understand, but also it's for the purposes of getting to action and getting the right housing built. And so we're also trying to not get bogged down in the analysis and make sure the energies go toward those actions. Sounds like maybe some more work is needed there, but Brock and Rachel, and then I'm gonna move us on to a little temperature check. But go ahead. Oh, and Garland too. Okay, Brock.
And I'm not even going to say this is a suggestion because I guess I just want to see kind of from people on screen, like thumbs up, thumbs down, how you feel about it. But what if it was kind of something, and I guess I'll reference CFEC in this, where like with TSP updates, right, you have like your major update and your minor update. If you had every 3 cycles, you do, you know, a full analysis, and then for the 2 cycles in between, you do kind of like here's the new information that we got in the last 6 years, 8 years. I don't know if that balance works better, but just trying to see if that's like a reasonable middle ground for people. I don't know if anyone. Maybe.
Seeing some like loose maybes, kind of a thumbs up. Might be moving in the right direction. All right, thanks for that, Brock. We'll keep chewing on that. Rachel, please go ahead.
Yeah, like everyone's saying, I think this is a really, really difficult balancing act, but I also think that it's really important to have clear and objective standards so that you know, what's written to the rules and challenged legally, and there's proper guidance for some of the cities that might be a little bit more hesitant to do the analysis in the first place. And just want to point out that 24 years ago was the year 2000. Seems like a lot has changed.
Good point. Garland, Matt, and then I am going to have to move us to try to wrap this up.
Hey, so I have just kind of 2 questions, and I realize it's a little bit late to call for be raising questions, but maybe these are questions for beyond this call. The first is, how does the alternative analysis of housing need intersect with the identification of needed capacity? And how is the latter ensured to need to equal roughly 4 to 5 times the former? That is, like, there's a lot of work in this alternative analysis on really putting a finer point on need, but I feel like there's just as much work needed on providing pathways to increase capacity. And so that leads me into the second one. What's the relationship between this alternative analysis and the safe harbor option? That is, what is the guidance that is going to be provided to locals on how to fix it? Okay, you identify this massive problem, you've got a massive capacity shortfall, and it's inequitable, and you need to do stuff in all your neighborhoods because this existing pattern is way, unequal. Say that's what the analysis says. What are the tools that then cities are going to be given to empower them to do the tough work to change the pattern, to fix the pattern, to take the inequality out of the system and deliver the needed housing? What's the path to success that's being laid out here?
And I think in this question, Garland, you're referring to capacity as housing capacity.
That's correct. Yes.
Human capacity of cities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's correct. Although that's also, thank you for raising that. Both, yes, but especially housing capacity.
I'm not sure we have answers, and I know we definitely don't have time to get into those questions, but duly noted. And also to say, safe harbor is on the docket for conversation and sorting out more in 2025. So stay tuned on that latter one.
And the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee also goes through 2025, and they're focused on the capacity related questions and housing capacity analysis.
Thank you. Good point. Matt, Okay, Matt, and then Brianne, and then for real, I'm cutting it off. All right, Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I just thought Brock's idea was pretty good about maybe that interim cycle, there being updates. And if that is a approach taken, I think one thing that I would require in either case is that there be updates as to any issues for which a city found no fair housing issue. I think the rules are good about asking for justification for that, and asking them to have a plan for ongoing monitoring. So it seems like it would be consistent with that to say on the interim, to have to do that every cycle to address the no fair housing issues.
Could I know we're short on time, Deb, but I feel like I need to make a pretty critical clarification here. Brock, was your proposal about, a major update every 3 cycles and a minor update every 2 cycles about the entire contextualized housing need, or just about the past discriminatory actions analysis?
Just the past discriminatory actions analysis. So like big report and then like 2 minor reports, big report, 2 minor reports.
Okay. And is that what your comments also reflected, Matt? Because when I heard you talking about the fair housing issue areas, that sounded broader to me.
Yeah, that's true. I think the fair housing issue areas are probably a little broader. I don't know, it gets a little bit too nuanced or confusing to build on the existing wording, but I do think, yeah, past discriminatory actions are really the key to, if they identify that there's no past discriminatory action in a certain issue area, that they should have to address that.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Brianne?
I'll be quick. I'd just say, kind of in general, agree with Garland in that I feel like overall we are spending so much time, and I totally appreciate it, I think it's good work and we should be doing it, but on the back end of like identifying and analyzing the need component, and we still will continue to struggle with how we are actually going to do anything about meeting that need. That's kind of just more of a holistic, and it's a big problem that no one alone can solve without a lot of money. And then I'm still just struggling with, and maybe this is just me, but how the contextualized housing need output, this analysis that's really going to tell us the needed types, characteristics, and locations, is going to intersect with our actual capacity and our buildable lands inventory. And I totally understand that that's a separate group working on that, but what if this is telling us that we need all these things and that doesn't align up with where we actually have capacity? And I think I'm not really sure how that's going to play out. So.
Thank you for voicing those concerns and cautions and things to think about. And I know this team is thinking about those as well. So we have a quick, what we hope is a quick poll. A poll for you just to sort of test out how well version 3 CHN, contextualized housing need, versus the alternative approach, contextualized housing need, are meeting the legislative principles for doing this rulemaking. So I'm going to ask Ingrid to bring that up. You may not want to answer these in the way that they're sort of a black and white, but if you could weigh in, and then let's see kind of where we are. We're trying to figure out where to spend effort in refining rules from here.
If I could just make a comment on this poll, I feel like if I could take this poll offline, I would like to actually sit with both of the texts and have them side by side before I answer these questions. I feel like I can't answer the questions without doing that.
Okay. That's fine. We'll take a quick temperature check here, and then I'll talk to Mari and Celestina about maybe extending this in a more thoughtful way.
I agree. This is Alan. I can answer these questions, but you're not going to be getting valid answers from me.
All right. It's a gut check we're getting at this point. I'm hearing you. Madi, thoughts on that?
Yeah, this poll's really only intended to get a gauge, but I think we can figure out how to have you all be responsive to this more intentionally after the meeting. It would just mean a survey and y'all's willingness to participate in that, which I have a note about another survey that's forthcoming. So I'm hearing homework.
And we would need, things are moving quickly in case you all aren't tracking that. So we would definitely need responses very soon. It would be a poll that's not open for a very long time. But I'm sure we can make that work.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I'm gonna suggest we go ahead and close this then, please. So we can close out the meeting mostly on time. It's looking like maybe for some of the first couple of legislative principles around regulatory uncertainty and around supporting promotion of safe, accessible, climate resilient, and affordable housing. The alternative may be moving us in a bigger direction again. Gut check moment here. We'll send this out in survey. And then maybe a lesser degree about some of the other two principles that are listed here, that the alternative approach might be more of a toss-up between the two. That at least gives us a starting place, and again, we can go forward and sort out a survey and then sort out rule language, which we're working on refinements right now. So, all right, Madi, can you bring us on home, please?
Yes, I can. I've got a couple of notes to offer to you all. Some important dates for you to consider. This week on the 23rd, so on Friday, our LCDC is having their commission meeting. And it is a public hearing. It is the official public hearing as part of this phase 1 of the ONA rulemaking process. Some of you already are signed up to offer testimony, but just noting it here for you all, that is an opportunity and available to you all to offer verbal testimony on the rules thus far. However, we still are continuing to receive written feedback through the channels that we've made available to you all and to just the general public. And public comment period does close November 14th. So just keep that date in mind. Keep it coming, but there is a deadline on November 14th. Kind of a date before that, though, is November 6th. It's the next RAC meeting. It's the 9th meeting, and it's kind of the last meeting before, it is the last meeting of the first set of rules before we go to commission for adoption on December 9th. So if you all want to plug into that RAC meeting, of course, do so. Some of you are on there, so you'll be already in discussion, but if you want to see how that discussion unfolds, November 6th is the RAC meeting, and all of that is available on the ONA rulemaking page. Then I noted December 5th or 6th is the adoption hearing, so keep that in mind. And all of that leads to our deadline as outlined in the bill, House Bill 2001, with rule adoption for this first phase of the work of the ONA rulemaking process for January 1st of 2025. So those are kind of some dates to keep in mind. Additionally, we've noted in the past, and this group has always been, this group's scope has always included the development of adoption-ready actions. And so we're going to, so today is our final meeting for the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. But we're going to shift now into the work of the development of the adoption-ready actions, including kind of guidance, including kind of the revamp of the HPS menu, And part of that adoption ready actions is also model codes per Senate Bill 1564. So lots of really good work ahead that I know there's been a lot of energy around, including the piece about continuing to talk about safe harbors and how that lives within the program, both the housing production strategy and the acceleration program. That said, y'all have been doing a lot, committing to this, and we've been meeting for since March. And it's been on part of our scope, but we also want to get a temperature read on whether you want to continue to support the work and really support the shift that we're moving into. And so please stay tuned for an email from me that includes a link to a survey to kind of assess or gauge, whether you want and will commit to continuing this work, and kind of a couple questions around what availability might look like, but also assess if there are, as you think about the scope related to the adoption ready actions work, if there's other perspectives and even people that you might feel we need their kind of perspective on that work group to offer that nugget in that survey. So that is forthcoming. You should expect that from me by end of day today, with a deadline to complete by end of day next Monday, which falls on, let's see my calendar, October 28th. So when I said earlier there's homework, there's that survey about just understanding your participation for the next phase of our work. That more than likely will begin with an orientation meeting in December, early December, but then like fully immersing into our discussions in 2025. And then we can make a second survey or whatever the tool might be that we have available to get you all to be a little bit more responsive to the poll questions that there was a desire for more time. We'll send that out. With that, I think the last quick nugget that I'll say is a warm appreciation for the collective expertise, the energy, and just your commitment to the rulemaking process thus far, to our charge, to our scope. I really, I hope you all can feel like the rules are, speak to the feedback you all have offered and the discussions, and we really are trying to weigh it all. And so, last call of appreciation, but also keep that feedback coming, and yeah, I'm excited to hopefully continue to work with all of you in 2025.
Mari, before we hang up, I'm so sorry to bring you back to practicalities, because I too want to wish or sort of imbue such a gratitude for this group. Can you touch on upcoming critical dates? Public hearing, testimony, RAC meeting, TAC meeting.
My question is specifically when we get the 3B version, so any updates that were made between when it was filed and when it's voted on by the commission. That's all I wanted to.
Got it.
Yeah, okay. To answer your question, Brock, so we are refining up until our LCDC. Well, we have a cutoff which is the packet for LCDC. That is the cutoff, and it's 2 weeks prior to December 5th or 6th. So if someone can help me with that date, that is really when you'll see the final iteration of draft rules. And so I think that answers your question. And it looks like Celestina offered some dates there. I can send in my follow-up email, I can lay out those dates that I offered earlier about the RAC, about the LCDC public hearing, about the close of the public comment period, and the LCDC adoption date in my follow-up email, so that everyone has that in written form in email. How about that? It's a lot.
Thank you, Mari.
Yeah. Of course.
But not wanting to end on that note. We really do appreciate so much work you all have done in 15 meetings and along the way between meetings And it's been this isn't the end necessarily, unless you choose to get off here. But it's been a real pleasure facilitating discussions among you and hearing the thoughtfulness of colleagues around the state. So thank you for that. All right. Are we good?
I think we are. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.